The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
What is international justice?
Are leaders who start wars or allow the killing of civilians ever made to pay for their actions?
The International Criminal Court's been working for more than 20 years, but there have been very few successful cases.
Only a few leaders have gone to jail. Almost all of them are from Africa.
There are warrants out to arrest Vladimir Putin, and now a request for one for Binyamin Netanyahu. But will they ever appear in the dock?
Is the system just a cover for our inability or unwillingness to enforce human rights rules equally across the world?
And do dictators take any notice?
The Y Curve.
So you do have to wonder, don't you, whether, the International Criminal Court is actually doing any good. How many people are they arresting? How many people are facing trial and actually being
some
charged?
people have been put in jail. It has happened, mainly in Africa.
As you said.
And people have pointed and said, oh, well, they're just the weak ones who can't push back, essentially.
Yeah.
But maybe in Africa there are warlords who say, well, I better not do that because I might end up in prison. But you kind of wonder. But they've issued...
I suspect it's not. It's one of those after the event things, isn't it? Is it actually going to be something that prevents a behaviour? And I don't think so.
Well, I just don't know that, the value of deterrence is an interesting one.
Netanyahu, for example, is thinking, maybe I won't go into Rafah because I might be found to be a war criminal.
I think, the one thing about Israel, it is a democracy, and, potentially people might, his own electorate might be thinking, hang on a second, maybe not. And he hasn't actually had an arrest warrant issued yet. It's potentially there. There has been one issued, of course, Vladimir Putin. But, the chances of him ending up in The Hague, I think, are pretty thin. Just because, well, why would he? But I suppose maybe he can't travel places. So there's lots of reasons why it might work,
But lots of countries are not signatories to the International
US,
Criminal
for a
Court.
start.
Well, yeah, they're the biggest. Israel, obviously, isn't as well.
Yeah.
So, and then you get, we've also got, the debate going on locally as well about the European Court and human rights as well. Should we?
Well, there's lots of international courts.
Yeah.
There's the International Court of Justice. There's all kinds of different sectors. But the interesting thing with this one is it's almost deliberately set up to go after leaders, heads of state, people who make the decisions, trying to make them accountable. That was the original idea back in 2002.
Right. But accountable for something that's already happened.
Well, that's the
actually, by the time the decision has been made, it's all too late, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
Because you're charging people for stuff that has already happened.
But it makes, there is the sort for justice. People who have suffered and their relations, they want justice and want to see it.
Yeah.
Let's dig into this and see how effective the ICC actually is. Dr. Clare Frances Moran is a lecturer in public international law at Aberdeen University. She also wrote the book, The Authority of International Law, a Controversial Concept. And she joins us now.
So Claire, does any international law really have any sway on a sovereign nation, or certainly very much the rhetoric in the UK at the moment is we don't want anybody else determining our laws. We want to be governed by ourselves. And I'd imagine that is pretty much the same around the world, isn't it?
I suppose that is not a feeling or approach confined to the United Kingdom. Every state is indeed sovereign, and most states want to maintain that sovereignty. But international law in many ways doesn't necessarily undermine that sovereignty because it's built on the principle of consent and also on the principle of consensus. So states would not be able to be bound by international law unless they wanted to be bound by it.
Right. The founding of the court, the International Criminal Court, which is, I suppose, the most obvious forum for criminal proceedings in international law, that goes back more than 20 years now. Would you say it's been successful in the way in which it was envisaged in terms of, I suppose, holding leaders to account?
I think that it's had a measure of success for certain. It depends on the measurement of success that you want to ascribe to it. The International Criminal Court has secure prosecutions for a number of different, what are referred to as situations, so different conflicts around the world.
But there haven't been that many, have there? I was looking through some of the statistics, and the number of actual convictions, and particularly of anyone outside Africa, has been very small.
The number of convictions is still quite low for certain. That's the case. And the other thing probably to note is that it takes a very long time to bring a case to fruition, to prosecute a case. So it can take place over several years, if not a couple of decades. So it does depend, but for those who were victims of, for example, Dominic Baldwin's field judgment was heard last year, for those who've been victims of these crimes, then they would probably measure it as a success because it offers them justice that they might not have otherwise had. So I suppose it depends on the perspective taken, but there has been a degree of success in some respects. In other respects, one of the examples I was thinking of is President al-Bashir of Sudan. There's been an arrest warrant out for him for a number of years, and we've not managed actually to secure a prosecution at least for him.
Why is that? Because we don't know where they are, or because they're just avoiding going to the countries where they know they could be arrested, or even if they do go to those countries, are they managing to get in and out without being arrested?
I think for sure a combination of all three. It's hard to arrest a leader, arrest someone who travels with diplomatic protection, who is visiting countries in which they will be hosted by different agencies and things like that. It can be really hard to secure their arrest. So I think it is a mixture of these things. And also you are aiming for the sort of the head of a state as well in that respect, in that particular case. So it's always going to be very difficult to arrest that particular individual.
And the basis of it all, Dr. Moran, is that there is this law which has been accepted, or an idea which has been accepted by a certain number of countries, that they will allow the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. But can it be imposed on countries that don't accept its jurisdiction? To what extent can their leaders be held accountable by the ICC? I mean, how does this actually work?
So an example would be Netanyahu, wouldn't it?
Yes, because Israel has not signed up to it.
So to use that particular example, it's because the crimes alleged have taken place we should say as well, on the territory of a state party. So if you are committing the crimes on the territory of a state party, in this case Palestine, then that would also allow the ICC to have grounds for prosecution, grounds for jurisdiction, as it were.
So it's because Palestine is recognised as a state party in itself, that's why it would be appropriate. I mean, because Palestine is only recognised as a state by a certain number of countries in the world.
It is, but it has been recognised as a state party to the ICC for the purposes of jurisdiction as well. So it is possible for the ICC to have jurisdiction over.
So what are the laws? Where's the law book coming from? I'm assuming that this all sort of emanates from the Geneva Convention, but has that been built on? What are the laws that the ICC is upholding? So
the rules come from the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which is a big treaty setting out the things like the jurisdiction of the Rome Statute when the ICC has, or the Office of the Prosecutor has grounds to prosecute, and setting out what we call the subject matter jurisdiction, so the crimes themselves, what it has jurisdiction over as well in terms of the criminal act.
So it's the subject matter being, I mean, if it's a crime against humanity, or if it's a war crime, or if it's waging aggressive war, those things have different areas. Is that what you're saying?
There would be four main areas over which the ICC would have jurisdiction. Those are, as you've said, crimes against humanity, war crimes, aggression and genocide. Those are the four areas.
And the gist of, a war crime would be that you are, for example, killing civilians rather than aiming for military targets, which, let's just go back to Harry Truman. I mean, he killed many thousands of civilians in Japan. So would that today, if that had happened today, I'm assuming that would be seen as a contravention, and Harry Truman would be seen as being a war criminal, wouldn't it?
I think, again, that goes back to the idea of whether or not it is you're seen politically, or whether or not you can actually prosecute someone. So you can be prosecuted at the ICC for a war crime if you are carrying out any of the acts, and to sort of use the phrasing of the statute, if you're doing it as part of a plan or a policy, or a part of a sort of large-scale commission of these crimes. So that would be the first element, as it were, of a war crime. And then the war crimes, I think you mentioned earlier, the Geneva Conventions. A lot of the war crimes are taken from grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions themselves. The Geneva Conventions are agreed to by the vast majority of countries. They constitute, therefore, what we refer to as customary international law, in which the law itself is considered to be sort of accepted by everyone, as it were, and therefore you can argue a case on that basis.
But I suppose the nature of this argument is that a country like the US, even if there were a Harry Truman now figure carrying out a nuclear bombing, and one can take into account whether there were justifications or not, that's another debate. But the fact that it's America, which is not signed up to the ICC, but also the fact that someone looking at the history of the ICC, of the International Criminal Court, say the prosecutions have dramatically been clearly in one particular part of the world, most of them in Africa, where there are weaker countries politically who can't say no. Is that a distortion of reality, or is that actually what's happening?
I think there's 2 points to make there, actually, which are quite interesting. The first one is that if you are trying to indict the head of a state, which is not a state party to the ICC, then yes, it's not going to be that easy to indict a head of state, but also you're not going to have jurisdiction unless the crimes have taken place on the territory of a state party, or unless there's another jurisdictional link. I think the kind of second point that you're making there about the targeting of a particular group of countries, in particular in Africa, a lot of atrocities had occurred in Africa in which the individuals wouldn't have been able to get justice unless the ICC had taken up the prosecutions for a variety of reasons.
What about this case about Binyamin Netanyahu and indeed Hamas, both of which where the chief prosecutor, has asked the judges to issue arrest warrants? They haven't been issued as yet, but they may well be. But with the case with Israel, it is a very, very different situation than we've seen before. The arrest warrant out for Vladimir Putin. It's a dictatorship, pretty obviously, not a democracy with what we would see as a fair justice system of its own. But Israel is different. It's seen as being a semi-Western democracy, certainly democracy, with a functioning justice system of its own Supreme Court. Isn't a line being crossed in all this, perhaps, that might be interesting, perhaps even very challenging?
In terms of the country being democratic and therefore being able to launch their own prosecutions, which is one of the key parts of the Rome Statute, the ICC is supposed to be a court of last resort, wherein it only gets involved if there's no likelihood, again, to use the language of the statute, if the country is unwilling or unable to prosecute. So in this case, they would be able to do so, but they would definitely be unwilling to do so, and that has been made very clear by the Israeli government. There's no prospect of that happening. So it might be democratic, but there's no bar, I suppose, in democratic countries committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. It's possible it's the acts themselves that are key, not necessarily who commits them. And that, I think, when we're talking about the prosecutions, the convictions that the ICC has secured, that's one of the most interesting things. It has indicted and convicted leaders of non-state actor groups, and by that I mean non-governmental groups, so armed brigades and things like that, rebel groups, rather than focusing on governments alone. Whereas if you look at the prosecutions that took place after the Second World War, which is where you've got the sort of roots of international criminal law, it was all state actors that were indicted, people who were affiliated to government.
So it is all political, though, isn't it? That is the difference between, for example, a domestic court trying criminals, where you could argue that, it should be distinct from politics. This does get into politics at almost every level. So, for example, going back to Harry Truman again, I'm sure he would say, well, look, we bombed 2 cities in Japan because we wanted to bring a quick end to the war. In the same way that I'm sure Israel would say, well, we are killing civilians in Gaza, but that is, unfortunate. We're trying to bring an end to Hamas and to end attacks on Israel. So the same argument, we're trying to expedite a war. So there's the case for and against on both sides. But in each case, it's political, isn't it? It's not black and white. The ICC has got that problem that they are dealing deeply with politics, geopolitics.
I think that speaks actually to a really sort of interesting point that Karim Khan made about the conflict, in which he said that as he didn't begin the investigation in Palestine, he was talking about the idea that he inherited this investigation in the state of Palestine, and he said that it lies in the San Andreas fault of international politics and strategic interests. And
That's a lovely phrase, that, the San Andreas fault of international. I mean, that's
not wrong.
Yeah, it is. It's a very clear point, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he realised how difficult it would be. I don't think he realised at the time how difficult it would get, but I think he realised at the time how difficult it would be to commence any movement in that particular area. But there will always be, with international criminal law, there will always be a degree of political, not quite involvement, but I think interplay, because you are arguing and you are alleging effectively that you will prosecute, or that more crimes have taken place, crimes against humanity have taken place, and you're then levelling the charge that you intend to prosecute.
I mean, I suppose, looking back, there were two separate tribunals that were set up to deal with Bosnia, in one case, and the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, and another one with Rwanda. And in both cases, I suppose perhaps the international community had already decided pretty much who the bad guys were and who the good guys were. And therefore, it wasn't as hard to push those things through. And I suppose, picking up on Phil's point, because of the political nature of this, even if an arrest warrant is issued, and even if Benjamin Netanyahu one day goes into the dock in The Hague, it's going to be extremely difficult. I mean, the San Andreas fault of court sessions, of trials, it feels like, because of all that's happening, and the fact that it is such a debate that divides the world.
And I agree. I think it's really hard to have, even to a certain degree, a degree of fairness in these things when so much is obscured by politics, and where, as you say, people feel as though they perhaps feel they have to pick a side and they have to sort of argue one side is right and one side is wrong. And I think what the release of the application, or the indication that they are looking purely at the acts that have been committed, they are not particularly bothered about who they are, who the people are, as long as they are the people who are the most responsible. And that's, I suppose, another thing that the ICC was set up to do. It was set up to identify the individuals who bear the greatest responsibility for these acts, and then to indict them. And that is what is happening here. So this is, in some ways, an entirely likely conclusion of the intended creation of the court, or the intentions behind the creation of the court, perhaps a clearer way to say it. It's one of the things they intended to do.
So it's evidence-based rather than politics. It's hard, though, isn't it? Because that evidence...
Well, it's interpretation of evidence. Yeah. That's the problem, isn't it?
And the people who make up the ICC, I'm imagining it rotates to a great extent, but the people who are there, the judges who are determining the outcomes, I mean, it's going to be hard for them to remain politically unbiased, isn't it?
I wouldn't have thought so. I think all judges have a situation in which they will probably have personal feelings about things, and they will sit over cases that they again have feelings about, but that's not their role. Their role is to make a decision based on the evidence and to apply the law. And that's the critical thing that they must do. And I think they take, at the ICC, they seem to take it really seriously. I've been doing a lot of research recently on the Dominic Ongwen case, and the way in which they have taken such care to apply the law and to be very clear about things in their judgments is exemplary. So I don't think that it would be a sort of problem that they would encounter on a daily basis. I think the difficulty is that a lot of these problems, because they do seem political, there's a tendency to, particularly in the reporting, to focus on the political issues. Whereas, again, if you look at the sort of the detail on the application for the arrest warrants, it's all about the crimes that have been committed, the places that they have been committed, and those who are alleged to bear responsibility for those crimes, and for really, and this is again one of the purposes of international criminal law, the failure to suppress the commission of those crimes, where you are a commander, where you are in part of a war cabinet or in charge of a government, in charge of a country. You are not only supposed to not direct people to do these things, but if they are behaving in a wrong fashion, then you're supposed to suppress that. You're supposed to take measures to avoid that happening.
Is there not, though, another issue here, which is, in a way, the legitimacy of the ICC in this regard? There have been stories in the last few days about pressure coming from inside the Israeli Secret Service, in fact, on the previous chief prosecutor. That's unclear how true that is, but suggestions that there was that happening in the background. And now in the United States, there's a bill potentially going to go through Congress moving towards some kind of sanctions on the judges of the ICC or the officials of the ICC to try and put pressure on them because of this issue of them issuing potentially a warrant against Netanyahu. By making a certain judgment, you might then not be able to move your money around because the US will impose something on your accounts or this kind of stuff. I mean, that's almost physical pressure on the judges.
I think it is pressure, but I don't think necessarily one would cave to it. I think when President Trump was in office, I think there were similar moves to pressurise the chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, as you said previously. And that didn't seem to make much of a difference to the operation of the court. Indeed, she did not in any way undermine or remove the investigation of Palestine and pass it over to her successor. So I think that they don't seem, these things mustn't be pleasant, they mustn't be enjoyable, and I wouldn't profess to speak on behalf of either the court or the judges, but there doesn't seem to be a consequence openly demonstrated of the pressure being applied. But again, a lot of this is in a way a bit of a test case in that these motions through Congress, I think, will probably be maybe the first, if not the sort of maybe only the second time, but possibly only the first time that this has ever really happened. So we need to wait and see what happens.
And is it effective is the other big question as well. How many people have actually been brought to trial, prosecuted, and as a result of ICC rulings, and how much have been declared but never found? Just how effective is it as an organisation?
I suppose the question beyond that is: Do you think there are people who potentially might commit war crimes, but think the deterrent effect of the ICC makes a difference? I'm
suspecting not many. I suspect many crazed dictators will say, "Well, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I don't really care about the
because I'll never get to trial anyway."
I mean, I suppose if you're using the number of prosecutions, the sort of the cases, as it were, as a measure of success, then there are 31 at the moment. So that's not bad in terms of organising an international court which is dealing with a number of different countries, a number of different situations, different languages. So there are prosecutions that are taking place. They are managing to arrest individuals and bring them to trial. There are other cases, as I mentioned earlier, with al-Bashir, where you've had an unsealed arrest warrant for a number of years and no traction, no movement on it whatsoever, and possibly never any movement. So there are certain things that will not work. For the victims of those who have been convicted, the conviction of the person who caused them that harm or directed that harm has allowed them a degree of justice that they might not otherwise have had. At the same time, again, if you are a head of state, you'll have all of that protection, and that protection is not just political, as you mentioned earlier, it's not just financial, it's everything that comes with all of that power and the sort of the connections that you might have. So to a certain extent, it must be very difficult to ever indict someone who is very rich and powerful, because you are relying heavily on bringing them to trial and then being able to prosecute them effectively. So it must be very, very difficult. But I think a lot of the discussion, at least academically, and the scholarship and the responses to the applications for the arrest warrant, what a lot of individuals have said, a lot of colleagues have said, is that they're not hopeful of an immediate or even sort of prosecution soon. There is the idea that you're saying that what you've done is not acceptable. These things do have a deterrent effect in that way. So there is a degree of deterrence there through the issuing of, if these arrest warrants are to be unsealed eventually.
But is it as effective as, for example, moves made by other countries? So the United States is obviously not part of the International Criminal Court. If the United States is not happy about the behaviour of a particular country in the world, it's going to impose sanctions on that country, which is going to have more immediate effect than any court ruling, which is by its very nature is sort of like looking back at events that have already passed.
I mean, I suppose in sort of international law, sanctions can be highly effective. They can be really targeted, and they can compel people to behave, as it were, by instructing sort of limitations on their financial movements, for example.
But they are purely political decisions in that case, aren't they? That is a decision.
It's not judicial.
Yeah, there's no judicial.
I mean, to an extent, if they came from the UN Security Council, then I suppose they constitute part of their powers in international law.
Yeah.
But from a state perspective, yes, they would be. You're supposed to do so in response. It's supposed to be a response to a breach of international law. So it's not supposed to be just whenever they decide and sort of
I was watching the Reform Party on TV this week, talking about how they were going to turn back the boats and send them back into French waters, and the interviewer was saying,
international law.
Yeah, breaching international law there, and he said, "Well, we'll just do that,
do whatever."
So what would in a situation like that? What happens?
Well, it's not. Yeah, I mean, it would be more, I suppose, civil law rather than criminal. I don't know how that would play.
It would just be diplomatic relations would be destroyed.
As we draw this debate to a close, Dr. Moran, I wanted to say, I know you're not necessarily a futurologist, you can't predict what's going to happen, but do you think that actually either Vladimir Putin or Binyamin Netanyahu will ever appear in the court in The Hague? If you had to say they may or they may not, which way would you tend? Do you think they would ever actually appear in the end?
I would say never. And I think many people would say the same thing in the sense that you would never, I don't think, if you were experiencing and living through the Second World War and you were to have thought at that point in time that a lot of people who had been very high-ranking commanders, very serious players in the government in the Nazi regime, you would never have thought that they would have appeared before a court, and they did. And in that respect, I think that these things can happen. But it would depend very much on how that plays out, how the change in international politics takes place. And by that I mean how power moves, and that is an issue which affects the law, but it's not rooted in the law per se. But I would never say never. You just never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
So politics right to the end, that's the problem.
That is always the issue.
That's one of the main problems with international law. We struggle very much a lot of the time to apply the law in a vacuum, because it cannot be applied in a vacuum.
Yeah, but I take your point though. That there are facts, aren't there? There's lots of people have been killed. So this is the reason behind it. This is the perpetrator. All of that you could argue facts. Well, the argument becomes the reason. Was there a good reason for it?
And also legally, did they break or did they not break international law? But I think you've laid out the case pretty clearly and comprehensively, Dr. Moran, on that. Thank you for doing that. And we will see. I mean, it's going to be a really interesting moment if and when the arrest warrant is issued, and what the consequences are.
And what happens when Netanyahu sets foot in a country where he could be arrested.
Britain, for the sake of example.
Yeah.
But thank you, Dr. Brown. Really good to talk to you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. And can you be tried in a court for mismanaging an economy for 14 years? That's
not so far, at least, is the implication.
Not that I'm saying necessarily, of course.
I think we know where you're coming from, Phil.
Well,
we do.
Okay.
We do.
Yeah, perhaps they have been a bit.
Yes.
But the question is, how bad is the situation when we get
the UK economy?
Yeah. How bad is it going to be? So it was the Labour Party, wasn't it, who left a note saying...
sorry, there's no money left.
Yeah, who was it who wrote that? I wasn't in the country at the time.
No, it was one of the... I think it was the Secretary of the Treasury. Anyway, one of them. But yes... Are
we in that situation again? Well,
yeah. So whoever gets into number 10 after the 4th of July... Are they going to have any wiggle room in order to do anything that makes any difference?
Because they are both there saying, we are fiscal conservatives. We are, there's no debate there in terms of big spending or low spending. They're all saying, we're going to, stick by the rules and make sure that we're not getting into another situation where we just go crazy with money spending and then the bond markets go crazy and, we have another Liz Truss episode.
Yeah. But there are lots of little jars with money in them. The question is, what it goes on, what you take away from. One side saying, we'll crack down on tax evasion. That'll give us plenty of money to do stuff. Another one saying, we'll put VAT on school fees. That'll give us lots of money to do stuff. How real is any of that, given the state of the country's finances?
And can you grow your way out of it? As the other thing as well. If you do spend a bit of money, so it's sort of like becoming the, it's a Milton Keynes versus
Milton Keynes.
Milton Keynes. Isn't that fantastic?
That's Phil's favourite economist, Milton Keynes. Keynes.
Right.
We'll definitely find some stuff that Milton Keynes has written, and
Well,
he's just collapsing.
I know.
I think we better draw a veil at this point.
It's a Keynes argument,
But not a Milton case.
not Milton. Milton
Friedman
get confused.
or John Maynard Keynes.
What I was trying to say was, is it a Keynes argument versus a?
Yes.
Yeah, you know
I think this is definitely a point where we say,
it's
tune in
the day.
Tune in to next week's podcast, and you might get some sense.
We'll be doing it
out of
live from Milton Keynes next week. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening to this.
Bye.
The Why. Curve.